12 black high school students boarded the bus that morning, but only silence came back. In 1987, the small town of Baton Creek, Louisiana, was still steeped in prejudice and neglect. On the morning of April 3rd, a school bus carrying 12 students from Roosevelt High, all black children aged 14 to 16, pulled out of the school parking lot. Headed to an inter-school sports tournament in the next city, they carried dreams, excitement, and then they vanished without a trace. No accident, no witnesses. Everything just seemed to dissolve into the thick fog of Swamp Point, the notorious swamp sprawling on the town's outskirts. For nearly 40 years. The case file of the 12 Baton Creek children gathered dust in the Orleans County Police Archives. Every page repeated the same 3 haunting lines. Missing. No evidence. No leads. But this spring, a crew repairing the old bridge uncovered the rusty, yellow school bus, buried deep in the swampy mud of Swamp Point. The rear door hung open. The seats were covered in moss and algae, and right above the driver's seat, someone had scrawled a chilling message in silver paint. They never left this place. Cassie Reed remembered that morning vividly. It was one of those rare, stifling April days in Baton Creek when the sky was cloudless, and the Swamp Point fog was so thick people said you could cut it with a knife. Cassie was just 15 then, a sophomore at Roosevelt High, excitedly preparing for the bus ride to the inter-school sports tournament. But a sudden high fever kept her home under her mother's care. Cassie didn't know that what seemed like a stroke of bad luck had actually saved her life. For years afterward, she couldn't stop wondering if she'd been healthy that day. Would she have boarded that bus? Or would her name now be among those who never came back? Growing up, Cassie knew all too well the contradictions of Baton Creek, a small, close-knit black community, yet one kept apart by muddy dirt roads and invisible fences of prejudice. Roosevelt High, where the 12 missing children once studied, was a rare source of pride. Despite constant shortages, teachers persevered and students dared to dream. The school's old hallway walls were lined with trophies won by black sports teams, snapshots of competitions, and academic awards no one expected from a place that seemed erased from the map. That was where Layla Brown, Cassie's best friend, and 11 other kids disappeared. Layla loved wearing a tiny silver heart necklace her mom gave her on her 13th birthday. Cassie could still see her friend's radiant smile, hair braided in 2 neat plaits, sitting at the back of the class in her red team shirt. That morning, Layla had sent Cassie a beeper message. "He'll tell you everything when I get back." That was the last message Cassie ever got from Layla, the day the bus vanished. Police launched a small-scale search, thinking it had just gotten lost. But as days passed with no word, the search grew wider. Officers combed levees, woods, and the swampy expanse around Swamp Point. The only clue they found was a set of tire tracks fading into the mud before disappearing completely. There were no broken parts, no paint scratches, no evidence the bus had crashed or been hijacked. The disappearance was so perfect. It led some to believe in something supernatural. Meanwhile, Baton Creek's black community, already used to being overlooked, could only grieve in silence. They held small church vigils, plastered photos of the children on utility poles, handed out flyers, and wrote desperate letters to officials. But the news cycle moved on, and national media never paid attention to the outside world. The 12 kids were just meaningless names on a cold report. That nightmare shaped Cassie's entire life. She didn't just lose Layla. She watched as every family on her street fell apart under the weight of unanswered pain. Tyrell's mother, Ms. Martha, spent months unable to sleep. Sitting on her porch every morning staring down the road where the bus once rolled by, Mr. Clinton, father of twins Jada and Jamie, waded through every canal running into Swamp Point, hoping to find some clue, only to collapse in exhaustion and despair. In their small community, no one was untouched by the tragedy. Everyone was connected to at least one of the missing 12. Together, they carried the same relentless question for decades: what happened that fateful morning, and why did no one stand up to seek justice for their children? Swamp Point, the heart of the mystery, sprawled across thousands of acres of wetlands, part of which had once been an industrial dumping ground before being abandoned. Locals whispered tales of ghosts and white apparitions haunting the place. But to the residents of Baton Creek, Swamp Point was simply the land they'd been forced to the edge of a neglected, dangerous swamp swarming with bugs and disease. Its twisting paths were known only to locals, which turned the area into a labyrinth for out-of-town officers who easily got lost during searches. After 3 fruitless weeks, rescue crews pulled out, leaving behind yellow caution tapes dangling from tree branches, silent reminders of their failure. From then on, fear and helplessness gripped Baton Creek, not just because of the missing children, but because it became clear justice did not exist for their community. For Cassie, the nightmare never loosened its grip. She chose to become a police officer to find answers. By 28, she had made history as the first Black female officer in Orleans County, eventually rising to deputy sheriff. With every career milestone, Cassie quietly promised herself, "I will find the truth." But the 1987 case file lay sealed and forgotten, only to be reopened if new evidence emerged. For 38 years, nothing surfaced, until this spring, when bridge workers at Swamp Point unearthed the rotting bus buried deep in the mud. And Cassie knew her moment had arrived. The long, silent case had awakened, along with the old nightmares. And deep inside her, the bond with Layla and the others flared stronger than ever. On the morning the bus was excavated, Cassie was the first to arrive at the scene. She stood frozen before the rusted frame of the yellow bus that once carried the innocent dreams of her classmates. Its paint had faded until only faint streaks of yellow clung to the warped Roosevelt High sign. The rear door hung ajar, revealing rotting seats draped in moss and algae. Scattered on the hardened mud floor were a few relics: a blue ballpoint pen, a crumpled mint candy wrapper, and most chilling of all, a silver heart necklace, the very one Layla had worn every day. Cassie's hands trembled as she picked it up. The cold, worn metal pierced her heart, as if time itself froze in that moment. Memories came rushing back: Layla's laugh, their shared peanut butter sandwiches at lunch, the promises they'd made to leave Baton Creek for college. The area around the bus revealed unsettling clues. The top layer of soil was densely compacted, proving someone had deliberately buried the vehicle. Swamp Point had never been capable of swallowing a full-sized bus on its own. Forensics determined the bus was hidden sometime in late 1987, months after the disappearance, confirming it was no accident, but a deliberate cover-up. Near the scene, Cassie found a haunting sign: a red Roosevelt High basketball cap tangled on a tree branch over 6 feet off the ground, an impossible place for someone to leave it by chance. Inside the cap was a long, curly hair strand, caked with mud and partially decomposed. Later, DNA tests identified it as Layla Brown's, proving at least one child had exited the bus at Swamp Point. What Cassie saw made it clear this wasn't just a disappearance. Someone had planned every step, steering the bus into the remote swamp and burying it so thoroughly all traces would vanish into the mire. The silver-painted words, "They never left this place," scrawled across the driver's seat, read like a taunt, a cruel laugh at the suffering of the entire community. In that instant, Cassie felt certain whoever was behind this was still somewhere near Baton Creek, or at least someone knew the truth and had stayed silent for nearly 40 years. Her gaze drifted toward the misty horizon of Swamp Point, where ancient cypress trees loomed like sentinels guarding a colossal secret. And deep in her soul, she vowed she would never let this case fade into silence again. On April 3, 1987, Roosevelt High's Bus 17 pulled out of the parking lot at 6:45 a.m. carrying 12 students and a newly hired contract driver. The driver, Marcus Dillard, 37, had previously worked for a small tour company that shut down over unpaid taxes. His employment record was nearly empty, with no known family ties, no permanent address, and only a few scattered documents, according to the schedule. The bus was supposed to travel about 50 miles to Jefferson High School for an inter-school sports tournament, but the bus never arrived. It wasn't until after 7 p.m. that Jefferson High called Roosevelt High to ask why the team hadn't shown up. Only then did anyone realize the bus and the students had been missing for nearly 12 hours without anyone noticing. The initial search efforts unfolded in chaos. The route to Jefferson High wound through tangled levees, sparse woods, and most ominously, Swamp Point, a swampy wasteland once used for dumping toxic waste, now abandoned, damp, and nearly impassable. Baton Creek police focused their search along the main roads, while parents, neighbors, and teachers spread out along narrow forest trails. They found faint tire tracks on a dirt stretch near the swamp's edge, but nothing else. The bus, the children, and the driver had all vanished as if into thin air. In the first 2 weeks, police chased countless false leads. One person claimed they saw the bus pass an old gas station on Route 12. A truck driver said he spotted kids throwing papers out a bus window near the Holly Forest intersection, but security footage never matched, or simply didn't exist. Clues evaporated into dead ends. After a month, investigators suspended the search, citing ballooning costs. They suggested the disappearance could have been an accident. Perhaps the bus had sunk into an undiscovered stretch of deep swamp, or floated the absurd theory that the students and driver had run away together. A claim nonetheless included in the official report to close the case. The students' families were left to grieve alone. Local newspapers would occasionally revisit the story on anniversaries, but over time, even those mentions faded. On foggy nights, some Baton Creek residents claimed they could hear the sound of a bus rumbling down the deserted levees, or children's laughter echoing in the mist before dying into silence. Those stories became ghost tales, turning the disappearance into a haunting urban legend rather than a crime worth solving. When the bus was unearthed this spring, long-buried questions roared back to life, more urgent and relentless than ever. Cassie was the first to climb into the bus-corroded shell, each step heavy, senses on edge in the dank air reeking of mold and rust. Her flashlight swept over rows of crumbling seats, seatbelts still dangling, some buckled tight as if someone had clung on until the very end. Beneath the fourth row, she found a thin, mud-stained object, an old math test sheet. With the faint purple ink of the name Layla Brown still visible in the top right corner. But what made Cassie's skin crawl was what she saw scribbled in pencil on the back. "Ask Mr. Marvin." He cleared the way. Mr. Marvin Jackson had been a groundskeeper and levee maintenance worker around Swamp Point, employed by Orleans County at the time. Records show he vanished 3 weeks after the 12 students disappeared. His body never found. His pickup truck was abandoned at an old gas station, keys still in the ignition. Police notes mentioned Marvin just once before he slipped out of the investigation entirely. Yet longtime Baton Creek residents whispered that Marvin had been hired to cut brush and clear paths deeper into Swamp Point, right before the bus went missing, rumors they'd kept to themselves for decades out of fear. The message on the test paper confirmed what many had suspected: someone had planned every detail to make the bus vanish. At the scene, the bus wasn't the only focus. About 800 meters away, on the forest edge where Swamp Point met a collapsed section of levee, Cassie discovered the red Roosevelt High basketball cap perched unnaturally high in a tree. The hat couldn't have blown up there, nor ended up perfectly placed by accident. It looked deliberately positioned inside its lining. She found a long, curly hair strand caked in dried mud. DNA testing confirmed it matched Layla Brown's genetic profile. This discovery proved at least one child had been alive after the bus reached Swamp Point, raising the chilling question, where had they been for the past 38 years? And if they survived, why had none of them come back? With these two key pieces of evidence, the test sheet with its desperate note, and the hat containing the victim's DNA, Cassie finally had grounds to reopen the case. But she also realized she was brushing against something much bigger, a secret that could involve powerful figures who had kept the entire town silent for nearly 4 decades. The next day, Cassie pored over old police files and uncovered a disturbing detail. Everyone had missed the official bus route from Roosevelt High to Jefferson High listed travel along Levee Road 14, yet 1987. Local maps showed that section of road had been closed a month before the bus disappeared due to severe erosion. That meant the official route was impossible to follow unless someone had intentionally redirected the bus down another path, the only one leading straight into Swamp Point. This revelation made Cassie's blood run cold, who had drawn up an impossible route, then forced the bus into a trap with no way out. Another clue emerged as Cassie reviewed old emergency call logs. A handwritten note in the fire department's April 3, 1987 duty book mentioned early morning screams coming from the wooded area near the levee by Swamp Point. Reported by a fisherman named Otis Coleman. Otis, known locally for his drinking, had his testimony dismissed at the time, but he'd passed away in 2005, making any follow-up impossible. In Otis' abandoned cabin, Cassie found a decaying notebook, pages falling apart, and among them, a jagged scrawl reading "Sound of a bus in the fog," then kids crying, then dead silence. As the fiery red sunset settled over Swamp Point, Cassie returned to the scene. She noticed a subtle but crucial detail: shallow drag marks in the hardened mud beneath where the bus had been buried, as if someone had pushed or steadied the bus into its final position. Forensic analysis confirmed the drag marks were made around the same time the bus was hidden. Months after the initial disappearance proof, the cover-up had been a prolonged operation, with someone tending the scene until the evidence was safely swallowed by time and swamp. The combination of the impossible bus route, the chilling screams documented by Otis, the drag marks beneath the bus, and the physical evidence convinced Cassie this was no accident or teenage runaway. It was an organized abduction, meticulously planned, likely aided by someone with intimate knowledge of the swamp's labyrinthine levees. The disappearance of the 12 Roosevelt High students had now become the biggest case Baton Creek had ever seen, and Cassie knew one wrong step could mean losing the only chance to finally uncover the truth, as soon as the case file was officially reopened. Cassie began to notice glaring contradictions hidden in the old records. In the original statement given by Luther Price, the backup driver at Roosevelt High, who was supposed to take the route if Marcus Dillard hadn't accepted the shift, he recalled Marcus being unusually eager. Arriving over an hour early to familiarize himself with the route, Luther distinctly remembered Marcus carrying an old, dusty map covered in red ink notations. Yet the official police report never mentioned the map. And Luther Price was never interviewed a second time. The omission raised a troubling question: who had scrubbed these details from the file? Another lead surfaced when Cassie tracked down the time logs at Morning Fix Garage, the only shop in the area licensed to service school buses at the time. Records showed Bus 17 had been brought in on March 27, 1987 for brake replacement and steering alignment. But the garage owner, Harold Jenkins, swore no one came to pick up the bus for 2 days after the repairs were done. He remembered clearly, "I kept the keys. The bus sat in my yard until March 30th when a man not wearing a school uniform showed up, claimed he was authorized by the vice principal, but never showed any paperwork." Who was this man? Why did he collect the bus early? And who gave him the authority? Cassie then visited Marilyn Cross, Roosevelt High's vice principal in 1987, now in her 70s and living in a small nursing home in Baton Creek. Marilyn admitted she had signed papers allowing Marcus Dillard to retrieve the bus once it was fixed, but she insisted she never sent anyone else. It was only supposed to be Marcus. I don't remember anyone else." Her voice trembled with age and fear when she learned the case had been reopened. Cassie left the nursing home with a bitter realization the case had been buried either by staggering negligence, or worse, by someone's active complicity in betraying the children they were meant to protect. Things only grew more tangled when Cassie reviewed old traffic camera footage along Levee Road 14 near Swamp Point, discovering the sole surviving VHS tape from April 1987. The grainy images showed a faint streak of yellow light cutting through the mist at 5:12 a.m. An impossible time since the bus wasn't supposed to be near Swamp Point so early. If that streak was Bus 17, who had steered it off schedule nearly 2 hours before the tournament, and why did no other intersection cameras capture a matching vehicle? The web of contradictions deepened when Cassie unearthed the patrol log of then Police Chief Roy Mallard. The notes showed that at 5:30 a.m. on April 3, 1987, Roy reported driving down Levee Road 12, a route outside his normal patrol area, placing him within 3 miles of Swamp Point just minutes after the mysterious bus sighting. Yet the case file recorded Roy's sworn statement claiming he was nowhere near Swamp Point that morning. Cassie, relying on her instinct honed by a lifetime in Baton Creek, understood that Roy Mallard wasn't just the sheriff. He controlled the web of relationships stretching from peat mining companies to the waste processing plant that once operated at Swamp Point. A strange new detail emerged as Cassie reviewed the roster of students registered for the tournament. The original list contained 13 names, but the case files recorded only 12 missing children. The name left out was Michael Rivers, an 11th grader with excellent grades who had abruptly dropped out days before the disappearance. His family vanished overnight, leaving no forwarding address. That Michael never appeared in the official missing persons list left Cassie wondering if he never boarded the bus. Could he have seen what happened, or was he the missing key in this mystery digging into Michael's medical records? Cassie uncovered a chilling clue 2 days after the disappearance. Michael had been treated for a shoulder injury at Baton Creek Hospital. The records listed bike accident as the cause. Paid in cash with no insurance. The address provided was an abandoned cabin on the edge of the woods, 5 miles from Swamp Point. When Cassie tracked the location, she found the house collapsed in on itself, the floorboards charred with old burn marks. Amid the ruins, she discovered a cracked digital watch, engraved on the back with the initials MR, confirming Michael had been near Swamp Point immediately after the children vanished. The contradictions, the suspicious camera footage, the odd patrol timing, and Michael's unexplained disappearance painted a frightening picture. This wasn't a tragic accident, but a calculated scheme with powerful hands pulling the strings, meticulously arranged days in advance, possibly involving at least one child or someone close to them. Cassie realized that unless she found Michael Rivers, the truth would stay buried with Swamp Point forever. Determined, she sought out Harold Duncan, Roosevelt High's basketball coach in the 80s. Now nearly 80 and living in a small wooden house on the outskirts of town. Duncan still kept his old scorebooks and team rosters, where Michael's name appeared marked as a potential team captain, with the note talented, but distant, quiet. When Cassie asked about Michael's demeanor before the trip, Duncan recalled Michael didn't want to go. The last time I saw him, he said something that still chills me, coach. If something happens, don't come looking for me. Those words set off a cascade of questions. Why would a 16-year-old anticipate disaster? Did Michael know about the plan to send the bus into Swamp Point? Cassie flipped through the fading ink of Duncan's old rosters, noticing Michael had been absent without excuse for 3 consecutive days, 2 weeks before the disappearance. Unverified reports suggested a boy resembling Michael had been seen with Marcus Dillard at a gas station outside town. But when police questioned the station owner back in 1987, he'd shrugged it off. I don't remember. Kids came and went all the time. The statement was sloppily recorded and quickly dismissed. One foggy evening, Cassie returned alone to the bus at Swamp Point. Sitting in the driver's seat, she let herself absorb the heavy silence. Her flashlight swept across the rusted floor beside the pedals, catching on a long, deep scratch as if someone had carved into the metal with a knife. She leaned in and made out a shaky inscription. "MR was here. Don't trust him." The last 3 words were gouged deeply, betraying the carver's raw fear. But who was him? Marcus Dillard, the driver, or someone else lurking behind the scenes? Cassie returned to her office at dawn, spreading the evidence across her desk: the math test with Layla's desperate note, the red hat with Layla's DNA, the threatening etching on the bus floor, the time logs from the garage, and the conflicting witness statements. Together, they all pointed to the same chilling truth: someone had orchestrated a plan to make sure Bus 17 never left Swamp Point. And the one person who might hold the key, Michael Rivers, was either on the run or silenced. Cassie knew it was time to rip the past wide open, not just for the 12 missing children, but for the entire Black community of Baton Creek, who had waited nearly 40 years for justice. After countless sleepless nights, Cassie began scouring every corner of Baton Creek for any trace of Michael Rivers. The family's residency records had vanished from county court archives, as if they'd never existed. She dug through every possible scrap of documentation: hospital files, library cards, community center registrations, all either blank or abruptly ending in 1987. Desperation led her to the Rivers' old house on the town's edge, now reduced to a cracked cement foundation overgrown with moss. Sitting on the cold bricks, Cassie wondered, had Michael been erased by someone else? Or had he tried to erase himself to escape guilt at that moment? Cassie's cell phone rang. On the line was Dr. Thomas Grant, the forensic analyst who'd processed the DNA from the red hat. His voice was low, heavy. "I found a second DNA profile mixed in with the sample. It doesn't match any of the 12 listed students." Cassie held her breath. "It belongs to an African-American male, age 15 to 17 at the time of 1987. But it's not Michael Rivers." The revelation struck like a hammer blow, shattering everything she thought she knew. There had been another child, unrecorded on any official list, present on the bus. Who was this 13th child? Cassie's mind snapped to the faintest name she'd seen in the scattered lists: Jerome Matthews. 15, who had transferred to Roosevelt High from New Orleans just 1 month before the disappearance. His school file noted that Jerome had withdrawn due to sudden family relocation, yet there was no record of a transfer request. When Cassie tracked down the last known address for the Matthews family, the small green house had long been bulldozed to make way for a supermarket parking lot. Her only remaining lead was Ms. Loretta, the oldest neighbor still living across the street. "Ms. Loretta recalled the night the bus disappeared. I saw Jerome's mama dragging a suitcase to a black car. He was in the back seat, face pale with fear. They drove off toward Swamp Point. I never saw them again." That testimony turned Cassie's understanding upside down. If Jerome was on that bus, the number of victims wasn't 12, but 13, and Jerome had never been searched for. A cold chill swept through Cassie. 13 wasn't just an ominous number. It was proof someone had lied from the start, deliberately hiding a child so no one would think to look for him. Back at her office, Cassie's thoughts whirled with the grim truth about Jerome Matthews. His omission from the official missing persons report meant there had never been a search, never an alert, never a prayer raised in his name. He vanished with the bus, but was erased before anyone realized he was missing. Who had done this? Why erase a black child who had only recently arrived in town, with no roots or connections, with no addresses left in Baton Creek? Cassie traced Jerome's past back to his old school in New Orleans. She contacted the Orleans Parish Records Office, finding his enrollment file from 2 months before the transfer. It listed his father, Luther Matthews, as a construction worker, but no mother. Their registered address was a decrepit building in the lower 9th Ward, long gone since Hurricane Katrina. The only remaining emergency contact was a disconnected number for Aunt Shirley Banks, whose last known address led Cassie to a rotting house in Algiers Point. Neighbors said Shirley had died over 20 years ago. Childless and alone, Cassie was almost out of options. But in the archives of Jerome's old elementary school, she found a faded black and white photo labeled Jerome M., grade 4, 1980. In it, an 8-year-old boy stared solemnly into the camera, his eyes carrying a depth of sadness beyond his years. That image made Cassie's skin crawl, a child adrift. Rootless. Perfect prey for a kidnapping plan no one would notice. The photo burned into her mind, fueling a vow to find Jerome dead or alive and return his name to the world. That evening, darkness fell quickly as Cassie returned to Swamp Point. Fog crawled over the marsh grass like a living phantom. Standing before the bus skeletal frame, she placed Jerome's photo on the cracked steering wheel and whispered, "Jerome, wherever you are, I swear I won't let you be forgotten another day." In that silent moment, her phone rang. It was a young patrol officer near Levy Road 14 reporting a disoriented man by a dying campfire, mumbling the name Jerome in a frail, panicked voice. Cassie's heart hammered as she sprinted into the night, driving fast through the swamp's winding roads, headlights cutting swaths of fog like knives. Cassie arrived to a strange sight, a thin, haggard man in a tattered coat, wrapped in a thin blanket, crouched beside a smoldering fire. His salt and pepper hair clung in wisps, his gaunt face gray under the flashlight's beam. His trembling hands clutched a mud-caked red basketball cap, identical to those worn by Roosevelt High's team. Cassie approached quietly, kneeling beside him. He wouldn't meet her eyes, only whispered over and over, "Jerome." Jerome said, "Don't tell, but I can't anymore. I saw him. I heard him crying." Cassie laid a gentle hand on his shoulder. "What's your name?" His glazed eyes slowly flicked toward her. Luther Matthews. Cassie's pulse stopped cold. Luther Matthews, long believed to have fled town and abandoned Jerome, was right here, steps from Swamp Point, nearly 40 years later, clutching the team cap, a crucial link to the disappearance. Luther sobbed, his voice ragged. "They took me, and Jerome said if I stayed quiet, he'd be safe. But the bus didn't go to Jefferson, it drove into the fog. Then they pulled me out. I never saw my boy again." He buried his face in his hands, tears streaming down a face etched with decades of guilt and terror. Cassie took Luther back to the station, where a doctor gave him water and warmth before questioning. In the interview room, his hands still shook as he recounted everything a man in business attire at Roosevelt High promised Luther a better future for Jerome if he cooperated. Luther was instructed to bring Jerome to the school parking lot before dawn, letting him board first to sit in the back. But once the bus veered off route, Luther resisted and was beaten unconscious. When he woke, he lay alone at Swamp Point's edge, with no sun, no bus, and no help. Since then, he had lived as a ghost around Baton Creek, terrified of being killed for what he knew, haunted by Jerome's cries in the night wind. Luther's confession was the missing piece Cassie needed, a living witness proving the kidnapping had been orchestrated, involving someone tied to Roosevelt High. But the question loomed larger than ever: who was the person who arranged it all? And more horrifying still, if Luther was left behind in the swamp. Where were the 12 children, including Jerome? Taken that fog-shrouded night, Luther Matthews' confession sent shockwaves through Baton Creek, reawakening old fears and fueling fresh whispers. The town's long-held belief that the children's disappearance had been an unexplainable accident began unraveling into something far more sinister, an orchestrated conspiracy. As rumors spread, Cassie dove deeper into Roosevelt High's records, following a trail that pointed to a peculiar figure, Charles Easton, the school's director of operations, in 1987. He'd signed off on the final bus schedule, yet just weeks after the children vanished. Charles abruptly moved away. Tax filings showed he sold his house, liquidated his retirement accounts, and disappeared. Digging further, Cassie discovered Charles was connected to a juvenile correctional facility management company in Mississippi, one notorious for lawsuits over abusive and inhumane conditions. The trail seemed to end when Cassie learned Charles Easton had died in a car crash in 1994. But she refused to let it go. She combed through financial records and found that just before he left Baton Creek, Charles had received a large sum from the Orleans Youth Fund, a private trust created by local businessmen, publicly pitched as a scholarship initiative for underprivileged black students. Yet Cassie traced the fund's transactions and discovered that most of the money had been drained before April 3, 1987. The remaining balance vanished soon after the children's disappearance, and within a year, the fund dissolved without explanation. The Orleans Youth Fund opened the door to a chilling possibility the abduction had been camouflaged behind a veneer of charity, aided or at least tolerated by powerful local elites. Cassie felt her faith shaking, her whole life. She'd believed that justice was possible if you followed the rules. Yet the truth she was uncovering showed that the very system entrusted with protecting her community might have been the tool used to destroy it. Meanwhile, Luther Matthews slowly regained strength in the hospital, but he often woke screaming, calling out for Jerome with a terror that froze the hearts of those nearby. Determined, Cassie secured a warrant to search Roosevelt High itself. Although the school had been rebuilt after a massive storm in 1992, its basement storerooms still contained remnants of the old building. There, in a rusted safe, she and her team found attendance ledgers from the 1980s and a separate bundle of student files labeled reserves. Alongside the 12 familiar names was one more Jerome Matthews, and next to his name, 3 cryptic slashes, unlike any other markings in the books. Seeing Jerome's name singled out with that strange symbol made Cassie's skin crawl. The 3 slashes didn't indicate grades or disciplinary issues. They felt more like an insider's code. She sat alone on the cold basement floor, flashlight beam flickering across brittle pages that smelled of mold and rust, the silence so thick it felt haunted. Beside the ledgers, she discovered a small cardboard box filled with students' belongings, a pen engraved with Tyrell Johnson's name, a pink hairband belonging to Denise, and most gut-wrenching of all, a red rubber bracelet etched with "Stay Strong," the same kind Cassie had given Layla the day before she vanished. As Cassie laid out the items in the station's evidence room, the parents of the missing children were invited to identify them, one by one. Mothers and fathers collapsed into tears at the sight of objects they'd hoped were still in their children's backpacks, not hidden away in a school's basement. The room filled with the collective grief of a community that had suffered in silence for 38 years. Piece by piece, the evidence built a horrifying portrait the children had been handpicked. The bus never meant to reach Jefferson High, and the kidnapping had been meticulously planned by those entrusted with the safety of these kids. Realizing the scale of what she had uncovered, Cassie called an emergency meeting with the new police chief, Sheila Roberts, a black woman known for her integrity, appointed just a few years earlier. After hearing Cassie's report, Sheila sat silent for a long time. Finally, she spoke softly but firmly. "Cassie, I believe you. But if what you've found is true, we're not just fighting a crime from the past, we're challenging a network that may still hold power. I won't let you stand alone." That night, Cassie returned to Swamp Point alone. She stood before the rusting school bus, the night wind hissing through the marsh like the whispers of unseen children. The pale moonlight shimmered over the muddy ground, catching silver glints on the stagnant water. In that quiet, with grief and rage swirling inside her, she heard a fragile voice in her mind, as soft as the breeze. "We're still here." In the days that followed, Baton Creek roiled with a storm of fear, grief, and long-suppressed anger. News of the unearthed school bus and the explosive new evidence spread far beyond the small town's borders, catching the attention of statewide media. Reporters arrived at Swamp Point. Though most never dared venture far into the marsh, they snapped photos of the rusted bus half buried in muck, capturing scenes of grieving families laying flowers in quiet agony. Cassie barely slept, spending every waking moment piecing together fragments of the truth, knowing that even the slightest mistake could let this case slip back into the shadows for decades more. In her cluttered office, amid stacks of files and bags of evidence, she pinned 13 school photos to a whiteboard under a stark. Red headline, "The Baton Creek 13, The Untold Truth." Cassie gathered the victims' families in the community hall where, for years, they had held silent prayer meetings. Standing before them, her voice ragged from exhaustion yet unwavering, she said, "We have proof the bus wasn't lost in an accident, but deliberately redirected. We've found the children's belongings, and we have a living witness." Eyes full of pain and a fragile flicker of hope fixed on Cassie, an elderly mother, clutching Layla's necklace in trembling hands, whispered, "Are they still alive?" Miss Reed. The question caught in Cassie's throat. She couldn't make promises she might not keep, yet she couldn't crush the last spark of hope. Either, "I don't know for certain," she replied softly, "but I believe some of the children were taken away and it's possible not all of them are gone." The next morning, Cassie led her team back to Swamp Point to expand the excavation around the bus, as they dug deeper into the dense, foul-smelling mud. They uncovered more chilling signs, small, overlapping footprints scattered around the bus, as if children had been herded or made to wait. In places, the ground was unnaturally compacted, hinting that someone may have stood guard or kept the children in place. One technician called Cassie over to examine a strange hollow in the dried mud. Inside, they retrieved a Roosevelt High uniform button, its school logo faint beneath layers of grime unmistakably from the 1987 design. Long out of production, holding it in her hand, Cassie felt it burn hot against her skin, like a tiny ember of the children's lingering souls. Amid the swamp's oppressive gloom thick with the stench of rot and the whistling wind weaving through ancient trees, Cassie tilted her face to the ashen sky. A pale shaft of sunlight pierced the clouds, illuminating the button in her palm until it glowed like a tear left behind by the past. Around her, the search crew stood silent, unwilling to shatter the charged stillness. In that moment, Cassie felt the weight of her community's decades-long suffering pressing into her chest, the endless injustice, the stolen childhoods, the complicity that turned their grief into a festering wound. Turning to the young officer beside her, Cassie's voice was low but resolute. "Call the FBI. Bring them here. We can't handle this alone." She knew the decision meant challenging every force that had tried to keep this secret buried. But Cassie also understood that if she hesitated, Baton Creek would remain haunted, and the families would never know peace. As the team continued widening the excavation, they unearthed a length of decayed cloth rope tangled in tree roots, a final confirmation that the children hadn't simply wandered off or fled, they had been restrained. That afternoon, Cassie called a town-wide press conference, stepping onto the courthouse steps before a crowd of weary but waiting faces. Raising the recovered button high, her voice was steady and rang with quiet fury. "This is proof these children fought until the very end. I promise their families and all of you the truth will come to light, even if I have to tear this rotten past apart piece by piece, for a moment." The square was hushed, then scattered applause rose, growing into a wave of determined clapping as the community signaled they were ready to stand beside her. That night, as darkness crept back over Swamp Point, Cassie returned to the bus alone. She placed the button on the driver's wheel and stood in silence. The soft chorus of insects pulsed through the air, mixing with the rustle of reeds swaying like restless spirits. She closed her eyes and whispered, "You are not alone anymore." The final shot drifted across the faint silver words scrawled on the driver's seat. They never left this place before, lingering on Cassie's fierce gaze, unwavering against the night.